conducted as a part of the Oral History Project for the Dallas County Historical Foundation. And first of all, Mr. Kilduff, is that the way it's
Malcolm M. Kilduff.
That's what we need, the full name, date of birth, place of birth, and maybe you could give us kind of a little brief background before you became associated with the Kennedy White House.
I was born September 26, 1927 in Staten Island, New York. My early school years, of course, were there until 1937 when I was 10. My family moved to Washington. We lived outside of Washington in Arlington, Virginia, where I went to school and graduated from high school in 1945, after which I was in the United States Navy and attended Princeton University, and when I finished with my service in the Navy, which was just for a year, I then returned to civilian life, and in 1946 resumed employment with the State Department. I had started in the State Department in June of 1945, but my employment was interrupted by my service in the Navy. So in 1946 I returned to the State Department. I stayed in the State Department right until the time I joined the White House staff in 1962, during which time I worked in the passport office of the State Department until 1959. I came up from my first job, which paid me $1,440 a year, a magnificent sum.
Yeah.
And I had a very important job, I'll have you know. I glued pictures on passports. Everybody laughs when I say that, and then I suddenly remind them, well, somebody had to glue them on.
Yeah.
And then I got promoted, and it always has boggled my wife's mind that I was promoted from a $1,440 a year position to a $1,620 a year position. I looked for papers that were lost. and it always amazed my wife that they actually paid somebody to look for lost pieces of paper. But there again, it's one of those things that just has to be done.
It has to be done. I presume you found some.
That's right. Oh, I found them all. I was looking for eventually. But during this time, I attended George Washington University in the evening and in the morning. Took early morning classes. And then then in 1952, from 52 through 54, I attended Arlington Institute of Law and graduated from Arlington Institute of Law, which allowed me to get out of the looking for papers that were lost business, and I became an adjudicator, passing on the merits of passport applicants. I stayed in the passport office then, and rose to the position of Deputy Director of Domestic Operations, which included field offices in New York, Boston, Miami, Chicago, New Orleans, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle. And then in 1959, I switched from the business of issuing little black books or little green books, as they were in those days, namely passports. I got involved in I became assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. I finally found a home. It started my career in media, in press, and in public affairs work. Some of us in the media work still prefer to refer to it as public affairs work. I don't know, maybe it's a little less dirty than just media. I don't know.
Yeah.
I never have quite figured that out. So I was in the Bureau of Public Affairs, and we had some rather exciting things happen in the first couple of years. We had the shooting down of the U-2. And then after the election of President Kennedy in 1960, I stayed in that bureau, even though the political parties had changed, and stayed on with a new incoming Assistant Secretary of State who asked me to, in addition to my regular jobs as Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary, to coordinate the activities of the State Department in connection with preparing briefing papers for Kennedy's press conferences. You know, a lot of us have watched over a period of years various presidents hold press conferences, and we've often thought, I'm sure many of us have, gee, how does the president know all that stuff?
Mm.
Well, he knows it because he's been briefed on it.
He's been briefed on it.
And so we would send over a whole black book,
Yes.
probably about 200 proposed questions and answers.
Mm-hmm.
And it was rather amusing, and with no disparages towards President Eisenhower. I recall we would prepare a sheet of paper that would have the proposed or anticipated question the president would be asked at a press conference, mm-hmm. and then the recommended answer. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting at my desk one Saturday. These things always seem to happen to me on Saturdays. Mm. And the phone rang, and the voice said, "Hello, who's this?" Mm-hmm. And I said, "Well, who's this?" Mm-hmm. He said, "Well, this is Jack Kennedy." Mm. I said, "Sure it is." I said, "And I'm Francis Scott Key, and I wrote the Star-Spangled Banner." I said, "Who in the hell is this? Mm-hmm. Is this you, Jim?" Referring to a friend of mine. I pulled at my leg. He says, "No." He said, "This is Jack Kennedy." I mean, he said it loud enough and strong enough, I suddenly started to believe him.
Recognize the voice.
Right. And he said, "I've got some books over here that have anticipated questions and proposed answers." And I said, "Yes, sir, those are the press conference briefing books." And he said, "Well," he said, "I appreciate you fellas over there thinking up the questions, and I want you to continue to do that." He said, "But from now on, you just, I don't want you to tell me how to answer it. You just give me the facts, and then I'll tell you how I want it answered." Mm-hmm. And I thought it was rather amusing that that sort of change in emphasis had evolved since the preparation of the briefing papers for Eisenhower and those of Kennedy.
That was your first contact with
That was
Kennedy?
really my first, and then I would take the briefing books over to the White House and sit down with Salinger, and we'd have kind of skull sessions before a press conference, and I would usually attend those over in the White House. And then in 1961, when Kennedy visited France, I did the advance work for him in Paris. Yeah. And it was after that, in 1962, early 62, that Salinger called me over one day, again on a Saturday, and said, "Mac," he said, "can you come on over?" And I said, and I had just returned from a CETO meeting in Bangkok, and I went into the office, and he said, "Let's go across the hall." And across the hall, of course, went into the president's office. Yeah. And I walked in, the president was sitting there in kind of shirt sleeves, it being a Saturday, and he was more relaxed. And he swung around the table, and he said, he got in the habit of calling me McDuff rather than Kilduff. He said, "McDuff," he said, "how would you like to come over here and, you think you could come over here and work for Salinger?" Well, now anybody else in their right mind would have jumped at this chance. But not me. Oh, no. You know what my dumb answer was? My dumb answer was, "Well, I'll have to ask Secretary Rusk." And Kennedy just looked at me and he said, "Well, in case you haven't heard," he said, "he works for me too." He said, "And besides, he's known about it for 2 weeks." And I said, "Well, I just got back on a trip with him," and I said he never said a word. He said he wasn't supposed to. So that ended that. Yeah. And that was on a Saturday, and Monday morning I went to work as sworn in as assistant press secretary. I stayed there until 1965 with Lyndon Johnson. And of course I was with him. I did a great deal of advance work for President Kennedy all throughout the world. Yeah. And when he traveled, I went to Costa Rica.
Where was your office, say, in
right across the hall?
Across the hall?
Right across the hall. It was Salinger's office, and then mine was...
Almost daily contact, or?
Oh, yeah, or hourly contact. Because so sometimes he'd come over to take a look at our UPI or AP or Reuters or Agence France Presse tickers. Yeah, well, to see what was going on.
I always assumed the relationship between the press and that office would be very close.
Yeah, it was in those days. It has changed quite a bit to what it is today. The press are headquartered in what used to be the swimming pool now, and it's a good ways from the president's office. But the president, it was a very informal working relationship. I mean, you know, it's really like working for anybody else except he happens to be the president. And now, and it was the same with Lyndon Johnson. They were both very informal people. If they felt they wanted to discuss something with you, they'd either buzz you on the phone and say, "Come on over, come here, I want to see you a minute," or "Come in," or they'd just walk into your office and start talking. And which, you know, and for a poor little guy who started out gluing pictures on passports, that was a long trip, and I often kind of stopped and wondered, what in the hell am I doing here?
Well, here in 1993, relationships have changed considerably as has come out in these oral histories we've been doing, particularly with people out of the media, and I think between the media and, say, the government, between the media and say the security people, police, and so forth. Back in those days, it would seem to be a much more open relationship between these various elements than there is today. Would you agree with that? Or
yes, I would. First of all, the press, in a way, has changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Watergate had a great deal to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
If a newsman, such as the newsman who was riding in the car next to me right here in Dallas 30 years ago, Merriman Smith, if he wanted to know something and he came to ask me and I couldn't tell him but I knew the answer, rather than let him get the wrong story, maybe I would have to tell him the truth and say, now that's off the record. You can't use that. And I'd explain to him why. You'd never see it in print. Apparently you just can't do that today in Washington with the newsmen, that it's a dog-eat-dog world and everybody's out for themselves. And that if you tell somebody is off the record, the only thing you can do is hope that it won't get printed. But if the best thing to do is, if you don't want to see it printed, just don't relay it. Now, there were some news people who you could not rely on, or who would tell some other person. We had a couple of like that. You wouldn't see that correspondent report on it, but you'd find this one over here was reporting the story, and they hadn't asked a thing about it. Well, you knew what was happening, and then it would happen in reverse. We had that, a couple of very well-known correspondents would do that, but most of them were very reliable.
But you see the shift maybe coming at Watergate as opposed to...
At Watergate, when the press knew they were being lied to,
yeah.
Then I guess they had to take the position that, well, if they can lie, we don't have to agree to anything that they say. So as a consequence, it has shut down a very important cross-pollination of ideas and information, because sometimes you could get some very interesting information out of the car. And even from some of the people such as the TASS and the Zvezda correspondents, we were able to, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we fed them some things. I was involved in some of that, to find out just exactly how important and how determined Khrushchev was to face us down in Cuba with his missiles, and how determined, and they're wanting to know how determined we were in going to war. Well, they didn't realize that we had the 81st and the 101st, 82nd rather, and the 101st Airborne ready to go jump in there. Until one day, one of them had, one of the Soviet correspondents had a lunch with me, and we knew that had been reported. We knew it was going to be. But that sort of thing, that's a little use. But nevertheless, today, you just don't have this openness. I noticed
well, it's a very adversarial kind of atmosphere today, it seems to me. Like, and I like that cross-pollination phrase that you use, because I think anybody who was around then and can remember how it was.
Well, as long as you have a president, of course, who has the respect for the concept that the public has a right to know. Now, we have had presidents who the president has the right, would say that the public has the right to know as long as it's to my advantage. And I won't go any further than that, but you can guess who those might be. But certainly Nixon was one of them when it came to Watergate. But a little bit more than that. Hey, the so-called the phrase of managed news became well known, and that is true. The news was managed.
Had you traveled with the president, say, prior to the trip to Texas?
Oh yeah, I had done most of the from the time I first went to the White House, and even before I went to the White House in '61, I did advanced him in London, and then I advanced him in Ireland and in Italy, and I advanced him in, I forgot how many of the states, but in every state that he went to after '62, in the congressional campaign of 1962, which of course bumped into the Cuban Missile Crisis in October, but I did all those states. And,
but when you say advance, it sounds like to me you were there before he was there.
yes, and then you double back and pick him up and go out on the trip.
Okay,
right.
yeah, that's kind of what I want to get clarified.
For instance, here in Dallas, the White House had an advance man by the name of Jerry Bruno.
Okay.
And he, wasn't it, it was Jerry, wasn't it? Jerry Bruno was the advance man here. But, you know, as to what the schedule was going to be, all that has to be taken into consideration, because you have your local press to consider, you have the needs of the local press, you have the needs of the, in other words, and you can't go pulling a motorcade into town, into New York City at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and they'll all hate you and won't vote for you, especially if it's an election year. If it's in an off year, you can forget it and hope they forget it. But yeah, you know, and so every place the president goes, he has to be advanced, not just by Secret Service, but also by his communicators, the White House Communications Agency, as it was known there, WACA. I forgot what it's referred to now because it's a combined command now of Navy and Army.
Was there anything particularly different in advance to the trip to Texas, and I guess maybe specifically when the subject of Dallas being on the itinerary?
No, we were, of course, very aware of the fact that in his visit to Dallas in October, I believe it was, or maybe September, Adlai Stevenson had been belted with rotten eggs.
Well, yeah, he got hit with a poster, a picket.
Yeah.
Had a poster that.
Right, and then there was some
put
rotten
down and
eggs
said,
thrown, because I remember a great Herb Block cartoon showed the seal of Texas and two rotten eggs dripping from it. That it was a, you know, that it was, and so, and we knew at that point, we knew that the forces of Goldwater were starting to pick up in '63, preparatory to a run in '64 against Kennedy. But surprisingly enough, we saw in the day before, on November 21st, before we got here to Dallas, and in our other stops, we had seen very few Goldwater signs. Yes, we'd seen a few of them, and we'd seen a sign, you know, "Shame on you" for Cuba and all this business, but not too many, not to reflect the feeling that sometimes today people are crediting with what the feeling was at that time. And I don't think that Dallas had any, I didn't sense anything in Dallas. I know there was a full-page advertising.
There's a copy of that in our exhibit.
Is it? Yeah, I remember seeing that morning, because we saw that over in, I was staying at the Texas Hotel the night before in Fort Worth. We saw that in the early in the morning.
You had seen that before you came to
Before we
Dallas.
even hit the ground, the paper had been over there.
Well, I think there was some discussion, wasn't there, that morning about, say, whether to put the bubble on the limo or something.
There was, but the president always was, and unless there was a weather reason to leave the bubble off. And the bubble wasn't really that important, because that bubble was not the bubble that exists today.
Bulletproof or anything.
It was a piece of plastic is all it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
I mean, it folded up in, what was it, Bill, 2 parts? And 2 parts that folded up and went into the trunk. And all it was to protect him from the weather. Now, I don't say that the bullet would have gotten as clean a shot through that bubble as it would without the bubble, but you still could have gotten at him with the bubble on top. But the president always felt that the people, if the people were good enough to come out and see him, he was good enough to sit there in the open car and let them see him, and so he could see them, because he enjoyed that. I mean, you take a look at the pictures when John Kennedy arrived at Love Field.
Yes.
You know, the smile on his face, and there was nothing very comfortable about his doing that because of his back. He had an awful lot of trouble with his back. But you go over a period of years in any of these books that you have here of pictures of Kennedy in a crowd. I've got some pictures. There's one picture I've got in Costa Rica, for instance, where there are thousands of people. I think it must have been the whole country. And in one little dot, you can see the president. He was mobbed in because they had set up quote, police lines. The only problem was that the police lines, the Costa Ricans didn't quite understand it, is what we meant by using barricades. They had school children who all carefully made little paper link chains, and they went out to, quote, hold the crowd back. And so you can imagine what happened. But I mean, you know, we never thought of that. But that, and you know, and I think, I look at that picture today, and I think, look at this. Here he was in Costa Rica, mobbed by thousands of people, Secret Service, completely out of control, totally out of control. And God, he was safer there than he was on the streets of the United States. Not necessarily on the streets in Dallas, because I don't buy that Dallas is, you know, has any shame to live down. I don't think it does. Because after all, there have been, after all, McKinley was killed in Buffalo, and I've never heard that Buffalo goes around with wearing a mourning band. I don't see any sense.
Well, kind of recall for us, if you can, say, arriving in Dallas, what your impressions were.
Well, of course, there was
along the way.
no
Was
arrival
that-
ceremony scheduled for Love Field as such. It was announced what time he would arrive approximately and where he would arrive. And as the films will show, we had a pretty good crowd out there.
Yeah,
at
there were a
Love
lot of
Field.
people out there.
There were a lot, but there was no speaker stand set up.
No.
There was no microphone set up, so that we had no arrival. Typically, you would have arrival remarks, but he didn't have any arrival remarks, and indeed didn't make any. He and Jackie, as we would call it, worked the crowd, worked the fence. And
And that was totally by design. I mean, he did not want to do anything at the airport. I mean, the big event, I guess, was,
that's right.
was the luncheon
At the,
the
trademark,
yeah.
right.
and the
that was
motorcade, of
and that
course.
was to be the big event. And of course, he was very, very mindful that he was walking into a political bed of the forces loyal to Ralph Yarborough and those forces, those Democratic forces, loyal to John Connally. Because he was very fond of Governor Connally, as everybody knows. And so therefore, you suddenly find, and Yarborough was riding in the car with Johnson, and he didn't really know why, and I don't think Johnson knew why either.
Well, they were well-known political enemies.
But I mean, you know, here they were in various places, sitting next to each other and riding in cars together, and I never saw two unhappier fellows in my life. No. They weren't very happy about that whole thing, but it was important, and Kennedy was thinking of the 1964 elections, and he did consider this area particularly as being key to his own re-election bid in 1964, and to try to meld the forces loyal to Connally and those loyal to Yarborough, and to come up with a unified Democratic Party. He considered that this trip was necessary, to the extent that since 1960, when he was elected, Mrs. Kennedy had not gone on any political trips.
That.
I mean, she went to
get you to comment on
yeah,
that.
she went to Canada with him, and she accompanied him to Paris, which he mentioned in his speech at Fort Worth that morning. And but aside from that, she did, and she really didn't like political trips. I mean, I hate to say that, but it's the truth, and everybody knows it. No sense in, you know, edging on the issue, but that's how important this trip was to him. And I think she was rather enjoying it, if you want to know the truth.
You think so? Yeah, I was wondering about what impressions you were gained, as not necessarily in Dallas, but say, you know, along the way.
Yeah, no, she seemed to be enjoying it. Yeah. And I think
well, being the subject of a great deal of adulation and so forth.
Yeah, and well, really, and I think, and he also knew something, and being as shrewd a politician as he was, that and he said this, that as many people would come out to see her as would come out to see him. You know, at that point, you take any vote. I mean, you know?
Well, you talked about a sort of sparsity, perhaps, of, say, Goldwater. Did that hold true along the Dallas route? He came in from the airport.
Yeah, you can see it in the films. You'll see a few.
That's the impression I had too. That people had said there really was very few.
There were some anti-Cuba signs, but that was understandable, and we knew that because of your Free Cuba movement that was active.
Well, we must inevitably get to the point of getting down to the street in front that runs in front of this building, where we are right now.
We took this.
And so, if you can kind of walk us through that.
Well, I was riding in the press car,
Which was in relationship to the
the 3
memo.
afterwards.
3 after, okay.
And that was in any presidential motorcade in those days, you had a pool car, which was made up of 4 reporters,
Yes.
and usually in the press secretary.
Mm-hmm.
And then behind that, you'd have a pool of cameramen in one car, still cameramen, and another car, motion picture cameramen for the television cameras. Because in those days, they were shooting 16mm film.
Yeah.
So you had the 3 pool cars, and in the pool car I was riding in, press secretary's car, and the reason I was on that trip as acting press secretary for the trip is that Pierre Salinger, President Kennedy's press secretary, was on his way to Japan.
Yeah, that's right.
With,
He was with the,
with Doug Dillon and
Mm-hmm.
Dean Rusk for an economic conference, and he had decided he'd go along on that as a White House representative. That's enough said about that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that was the reason I was on the trip rather
Yeah.
than Salinger. I would have been on the trip and been in the motorcade somewhere, but certainly
Yes.
not up there had this
Yes, in
not.
that
And
spot.
the 4 pool reporters were Bob Clark of ABC, Bob Baskin of the Dallas Morning News, excuse me, Jack Bell of Associated Press,
Yeah.
and of course Merriman Smith of
Yeah,
United
yeah.
Press. And of course the driver was an employee of of the Bell system, who was, and we had the one phone in the car. So as we came we turned right here
Right
at
out.
that window,
Mhm.
and
This is off of Houston onto Elm Street and going down towards what's called the Triple Underpass.
triple
here.
underpass. Right as we passed there, I heard this first noise, and Merriman Smith said, "What the hell was that?" And I said, "Well, it sounded to me like a firecracker." And I remember having the thought process, well, it's a week before Thanksgiving, and they sell fireworks here. I mean, that much I can remember. And then the second shot, by that time I noticed that Clint Hill, who was a Secret Service agent assigned to Mrs. Kennedy, had jumped off the Secret Service follow-up car and was running towards the president's car. But then I looked up from where the second shot came from, and I was looking, of course, at looking up at this building.
Yes.
Now, I cannot say that I was looking at the exact location it was coming from,
yeah,
but I knew
the
it
sound
was
came
coming
from that
from
direction.
above and over my right shoulder. It was not
Yeah.
coming from the grassy knoll over there
Yeah.
at all. It was coming from above me and from my rear. And I
Yeah.
looked back there, and I could not, very honestly, I could not see anything. And
Yeah.
of course, now that I've seen it, I can
And this is
understand
after
why.
2 shots had
That's
been
right.
fired.
That's
Okay.
right. And then there was a longer space between the first and second than there was between the second and the third shots. And then I noticed that the Secret Service car and the President's car had started to speed up.
Yes.
So we sped up in the pool car. But that still didn't surprise me,
Yeah.
because after all, it was obvious that something untoward had happened, and that this would be a normal operating procedure to get the hell out of there
Yeah.
in a big hurry.
Yeah.
And it never, and of course Merriman Smith grabbed the phone in the pool car to say that shots had been fired at the presidential motorcade. At that time, and not until we got to Parkland Hospital, did any of us know to what extent. And I remember thinking that, gee, I wonder if they shot Connolly. Mrs. Kennedy get. It never even occurred to me that the president had been shot. I've heard people say.
Why do you think you thought?
Because I think that it is, this is America. It's inconceivable.
Okay.
The inconceivable nature of it all. Just blocked that thought from. That's the last thing this is America. We don't. We're not like a banana republic where we're going shooting off our leaders right and left. Of course, the fact remains is we've killed 6, or shot at 6. I mean, and if you take Roosevelt with Mayor Cermak of Chicago was killed. You take Harry Truman, and you take McKinley, Lincoln, Garfield. I forgot who else there was. Who else?
Reagan.
Well, that was before Reagan.
Oh,
yeah,
before Reagan.
Before
I mean,
Reagan.
you're talking before.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Yeah, that's right. Excuse me.
But I mean, we're not the freest nation in the world of having taken our leaders out the hard way. But nevertheless, I guess because when you're that close, the last thing you think of course, and I didn't have the view of the president that some of the people on the grassy knoll did, that who responded to newsmen saying I saw him clutch his throat.
Yeah.
Which of course we saw that in the Zabruta film.
In the films later.
Yeah. And even as we pulled, and of course as we drove out, I didn't know the area that well,
Yeah.
so therefore I didn't know where the Trade Mart was, where we were headed for lunch or anything else, and then we pulled into Parkland Hospital, and I ran around, as some of those film clips yours will show, I ran out of the car and went over, and there was the president, slumped over in Mrs. Kennedy's lap, and of course they couldn't remove him from the back of the car until they removed Conley and Nellie, because they were sitting on the jump seats in front of the president and Mrs. Kennedy. So they got Conley out of there, and Mrs. Conley, and then they removed the president. And that's when we went into the emergency entrance there at the back of Parkland.
Who was the security that was kind of managing this? Was this the Secret Service, the Dallas Police, both?
Secret Service. It was Roy Kellerman stayed with the president the whole time.
You went in with them.
That's right, and I also had police identification. We always wore buttons of different shades and colors. Bill here can tell you, the same thing. We'd go on different trips, and we'd have a trip button. In my pitch used to be a blue porcelain button with a white dot in it, and other times it'd be green with a orange dot in it, and all the police would have a card that would show what the authorized buttons were. Some of them were circles, they were staff. Some of them would be triangles, they were security. Some of them would be squares, they'd be a signal corps, something like that.
Yeah.
And
well, I know that they shut it down, or I understand they shut it down right away as letting anybody get into the hospital back there. And say a guy in a business suit if you didn't have your ID.
Yeah, they did, but the Secret Service even got to the point where they didn't even allow the Dallas police in.
Yeah, well, I'd heard.
Which got a little testy there.
Yes.
But Kellerman shut it down just completely. And after we got there, and when we got to the hospital, it still didn't occur to me that the president was dead.
You did not say visually, say looking at him in the car.
He was a mess.
But
you
didn't,
I guess I had a mental block.
At that point, he's dead.
No, I did not. And I went in, and I remember my thinking and recalling back when Eisenhower had a heart attack back in Denver one time. That Jim Haggerty had set up a press room, and they had a press thing. I don't know why I thought of those things. I just did. So I told a fellow who was traveling with us by the name of Wayne Hawks, who was on the staff, to go find something we could use as a press room. He came up with a nurse's instruction room out there at Parkland, and get a hold of the telephone company to start getting some press phones in, because you couldn't get it. Apparently, from what I've heard, you couldn't even get the phones lines were just jammed here in Dallas.
No, well, yeah, they were. I know some of the reports.
But I do know some of the people. I know Merriman Smith got a hold of a coin telephone right there outside the emergency entrance, and he got an open line right away and opened to Washington, and it stayed open. So there was no problem there. Jack Bell again was not very. He just lucked out all the way. I mean, had no luck at all. Smith had all the luck in finding the phones and everything else. By the way, he got Smith eventually got the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of that.
Yeah.
And ended up blowing his head off, but committing suicide.
Luck sometimes does play a role in these things.
Yeah.
Who are you working with, say, at the hospital in terms of getting information about the
Dr.
president?
Perry.
Dr. Perry.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was Malcolm
Perry. Yes.
Yeah, same name as mine.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the one who told me.
Okay, so.
And I don't know who Bill Stinson was working with. Who was, of course, he was working on the Conley side of it too, and we were equally concerned about getting information out on both of them.
Who, besides yourself, was, say, involved in the process of deciding when we're going to announce, what we're going to announce?
When it became apparent to me that the president was dead, and that was within a very few minutes after we got there, before 1 o'clock, I went to Kenneth O'Donnell and I said, Kenny, I said, we're going to have to announce the president's death.
Mm-hmm.
Kenny was chief of staff to Kennedy.
Yeah.
And Kenny said to me, and Kenny, of course, had been
He'd been close with
Kennedy's and
yeah.
a roommate of Bobby's at school.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, this was his life.
Mm-hmm.
His life had just been shot away.
Mm-hmm.
Kenny's now dead.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, hell, he said, don't ask me. Go ask Johnson.
Mm.
So I went across the hall into a trauma room where Rufus Youngblood,
Mm-hmm.
his Johnson's Secret Service agent, was. And I walked in, and I didn't know what to call him. And I didn't know Lyndon Johnson that well.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd seen him around the White House. He knew me by name, and I,
Mm-hmm.
naturally, you
Yeah.
know. But I walked up to him, and I suddenly realized I didn't know what to call him.
Mm-hmm.
The situation, de facto, he was the president.
Mm-hmm.
I said, Mr. President.
Mm-hmm.
And Lady Bird just kind of screamed.
Yeah.
Let out a
Mhm.
audible. And apparently, and according to him, and according to some writings of his, when I said that to him was the first solid information that he had, that he was the de facto president. I said, I'm going to have to announce President Kennedy's death. And he said, well, and and it's very interesting. And, you know, the man was a great historian. He had a great mind for history, Lyndon Johnson did. We don't know what kind of a conspiracy this might be. And later, and you could see it going through his mind of Booth, you know, with Lincoln and all this Mary Surratt conspiracy and all this business going through his head. He said, but I think Byrd and I ought to get out of here and back to Air Force One before you make the announcement. And I said, all right. So he said, come on, he said to Rufus, he said, let's go on back to the plane. And by that time, we knew that the president would be transported, the body would go back on Air Force One.
Yeah.
Now, the Secret Service made the determination that Lyndon Johnson would go back on Air Force One. A lot of people have been critical of Johnson, saying that he seized power at an opportune moment. It was not. It was on the advice of the Secret Service on going back to Air Force One. And number two, it was on the advice of Secret Service to use Air Force One rather than the backup plane, which was the second plane, Air Force Two, if you will. When we got him out of the emergency entrance, I walked out with him. Bob Pierpoint, I remember, of CBS, said he remembers seeing me come out, but doesn't remember seeing Johnson. Well, I don't know how he could ever miss Lyndon Johnson coming out. We put him in the car, and we got back. And as soon as we got the word, and in those days the code was his I always tickled me, his code name was Volunteer. And it always tickled me because Lyndon Johnson was about as much of a volunteer to being in the White House as nothing, but I mean, it was kind of amusing. And it said that Volunteer had returned to Angel. And as soon as I got that, Angel was the code name for Air Force One.
Were there other reactions? I mean, do you think Johnson's reaction to fearing that there was a conspiracy, was that sort of the common reaction among the people within that
It wasn't
group,
in mine, and it wasn't in Kenny O'Donnell's. A lot of people have had second thoughts about it, and have will say today, "Oh, I thought right away it was a conspiracy." Well, if they did, they sure as hell kept their mouth shut about it at the time. I think that hindsight is always 20/20.
Yeah.
But I sure didn't hear about it. No, and they did not talk about it even there at the hospital or even coming back on Air Force One.
Yeah.
But Johnson, you could see it. He was forever the historian.
Yeah.
And by that time, of course, and then after he cleared and after I'd received word that he was back, and at approximately 1:31, I went ahead and made the announcement that you have here. At least I think you have it.
Yes, we do.
And made the announcement. And then when the body was returned to, they wanted to keep the body here for an autopsy.
Yes.
And that's when Roy Kellerman and some other agents and myself formed sort of a flying wedge. And the Dallas police were told to keep the body here. And Roy Kellerman had received word from headquarters to bring it back to Washington for an autopsy at Walter Reed.
Yeah.
Or at Bethesda Naval, whichever was to be used. And we flew out that door and put the casket in the an ambulance, and we took off and went to Love Field.
How spirited was the effort to keep you from doing that? Was that?
There were a couple of detectives who were quite spirited upon them. I remember looking down on them on the floor as I passed them. One of them took a rather nasty hit, I don't know by whom, but one of them went down.
Well, there was a law or an ordinance or whatever that the body couldn't be removed, but we did an oral history with Henry Wade, who was the district attorney at the time, and he rather wryly observed that, well, it was breaking a law, but the only penalty for that law was a $100 fine.
Oh, really?
Was anybody aware of that?
No.
So, it wasn't that big a deal.
No, and then we went back to Air Force One, and by that time, Lyndon Johnson had contacted the Attorney General, of course, President's brother.
Yes.
You know, in calling a spade, and you got to do it, there was no love lost between Lyndon Johnson and Robert Kennedy. Even though he stayed on as Attorney General, they were not exactly enamored of each other. But Bobby advised him that in case any presidential decisions, not knowing what was going on, that it would be best if he was sworn in here.
Okay, so that came from Bobby Kennedy.
That came from Bobby Kennedy. Now here again, history loves to rewrite itself because you'll find among some of the Kennedy people here again that Johnson had seized the power as quickly as he could. He did not do that at all. He did this on the advice of the Kennedys. If you accept Bobby as the Kennedys, which I think you have to.
Yeah.
So that was a decision made by the Attorney General that he should be sworn in, and of course he was sworn in as we have photographic knowledge on Air Force One, and sworn in by Judge Sarah Hughes, which of course was another slight irony, as you probably know.
Well, and you want to explain that for us? Or?
Well, he, as you know, Lyndon Johnson had opposed her appointment to the federal bench, as a federal district court judge, and it's every time I see that picture of the swearing in with President Lyndon Johnson looking down at Judge Sarah Hughes, wondering to myself, now what in the world was he really thinking of all the judges in this world? They had to find this one.
Well, she was sort of a leading jurist in the city, and at least in terms of a public profile. I don't know if that had anything to do with it or not. But
no, it's just I think they got a hold of the first federal court judge that they could.
That was her.
Just happened to be her, and I know that it was reported back to me that he had opposed her appointment to the federal bench.
Now, did you go from the hospital with the casket, or
you mean
back to the Air Force One at Love Field? I mean,
yes.
In Dallas. Getting back. Okay. Now, as you pointed out, we looked at the photograph. You were recording the swearing in. That's the only.
That's correct. On Air Force One, in the president's cabin.
You had the foresight to do that. And you want to tell us about that? I mean,
no, well, as we got on Air Force One, and all the Kennedy people were in the far aft section of the plane around the casket. They had removed 4 seats from the back section. That back section of Air Force One at that time contained a conference room and a bedroom, and then behind that 4 more seats and an aft galley. They had removed the seats from the 4 seats to make room for the casket. The Kennedy, some of the Kennedy people, Pamela Tourneur, Mrs. Kennedy's press secretary, Mrs. Gallagher, Mrs. Kennedy's secretary, was back there with her. Ken O'Donnell and Dave Powers stayed in the aft section of that plane. Then when Judge Hughes came aboard, the president asked that Mrs. Kennedy be invited to come up during his swearing in. I suppose that was a no-win situation.
Yeah.
That some of the people would be critical that he wanted her by his side, whether despite any ill feelings that there might have been. But she did come forward. She was only too gracious about coming forward. She never blinked an eye, or twitched a muscle. And on that, some of those pictures, again, you can see the blood on that red suit of hers. And she stood right next to him as he was sworn in as our president. And then within very few moments, of course, after Judge Hughes left the aircraft, we were airborne and back to Washington.
Nothing on that flight, whether you want to...
Yeah, everybody, we all drank about as much as human beings could possibly consume, but nobody got drunk.
Yeah.
It was absolutely amazing. I don't know how much we had to drink or how many of us did drink, but I know I had plenty, and yet that was on a Friday, and I did not end up going to bed for a full night's sleep until the following Wednesday.
Well, and some of the conspiracy theories that developed over the years later talk about a casket switch on the plane and stuff.
I've never
like
understood that because the casket was the same casket that had been delivered to the hospital here by a local man.
A funeral home man, I think.
A funeral home man here in Dallas.
Yeah.
Now, in removing the plane on the forklift at Andrews Air Force Base, one of the handles got broken. And for that reason, they got another casket from Gawler's Funeral Home in Washington, but that was not until after they had taken the body out to Bethesda. Was it Bethesda Naval or Bethesda Naval Hospital?
Yeah, I think so.
And that's when the casket, that's when the switch in the caskets were made. But they had to remove his body to do a full post-mortem anyway. So I mean, that's, that was. Did they switch the body? Of course they switched the body from one casket to another. But they would have removed him from the casket in any event.
In any event,
Yeah. So I mean, all these things, if they're put in the wrong perspective, take on meaning that the conspiracy enthusiasts love. But when you take a look at it in the cold, hard light of day, they're all things that were done perfectly normally.
Where did you go, say, after you arrived back in Washington?
I went back to the White House.
To the White House.
I went back on the well, there were helicopters there.
Yeah.
Now
Salinger was still out over the Pacific.
He was out over the Pacific. Oh, that was another thing.
Yeah,
I had Salinger in his book, I think in one of the books, there's a section called Wayside to Warrior, or Warrior to Wayside. I was Warrior, and he was Wayside. And there's a picture outside of the Parkland Hospital of my on a phone in the Secret Service follow-up car. And what I did is I patched into Dallas Base. Dallas Base went to Washington, which patched into that aircraft, which had just taken off from Wake Island.
Okay.
And I got a hold of Rusk, answered the phone on that plane. And Salinger was in the cabin, apparently in that same type cabin that on one of the other planes that we had taken the oath on in Air Force One in 26000. And but as he, so I got on there and I said that the Lancer was dead. Well, now they had received some scattered messages on their AP machine in that plane, something about Kennedy, but they were unable to determine what it was. So I told them that Wayside was dead. And that's how it sounded. Okay, I got you.
Okay, let me just flip this over. This is my backup, but well, you were.
So that's how Salinger told Rusk, and then they turned around and I think they went back to Wake and refueled, and then came back in. And Pierre came in the office, I know, about 4 o'clock that next morning. About 4 in the morning he came in the back door. But then I went back and I went by helicopter directly to the White House. We landed on the south lawn of the White House when President Johnson got into his car and went out to his home out in Spring Valley, which is a suburban section of Washington. And of course he stayed there until after Thanksgiving. And
well, you sure had a kind of awesome responsibility on your shoulders at that time. Was it Were you thinking about that when all
No,
this was
no,
happening?
no. I think it's one of those things that happens to you, and when it's all over. You ever been in a close call in an automobile accident, and you think everything's fine, and then an hour later you suddenly look at your hands and they're all filled with sweat?
Yeah.
It's no, but you're aware of the fact that here is history being made. You don't think of yourself in relationship to that history. In other words, you don't think of yourself, well, what part am I playing in the history? That certainly I never didn't even think about. But but suddenly, and you stop and you think, oh my God, what look what's happened. And and it was certainly far more traumatic than other things that I had witnessed. Such as the attempted assassination of Harry Truman, and of course the Sunday that my mother and father and I went to Lakehurst, New Jersey, to watch the Hindenburg come in. I feel like that fellow that Al Capp used to draw, Joe Blitzfitz with a little black cloud over him. But no, you don't think about that at the time. You don't think about
what was maybe kind of the most difficult thing in that time period was just trying to...
The most difficult thing was to say that John Kennedy was dead. The film will show that. I stutter on that.
Yeah.
And I didn't get into it clean. Because I guess it's sort of like telling somebody that a close friend has died. It's hard to come out. It's hard. You don't want to say it, because once you've said it, it makes it so. And in reflection, I think that's how I felt. I know that's how I felt. That by saying it, it's so. And if I don't say it, it won't be so.
What do you remember about, say, the press that you were making this announcement to?
I have no recollection of the press in front of me.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah.
I just, to me, it was a sea of faces. I remember off to one side, there was a great fellow from the Washington Post, old fellow. He's dead now. Can't remember, but I remember him. He was a marvelous, good old what's his name, but I mean, it was he was just Eddie Folliard. Had been with the Washington Post for a year. I remember seeing him over there. And I remember Merriman Smith right in front of me, of course. And I remember a fellow by the name of Chuck Reynolds, who was a guy with the Alderson Reporting Company. He did the stenotyping. He was sitting right in front of me. One of your photos, I think, around here shows that. Or maybe it's just in my book.
What about when you got back to Washington? Of course, this was a different group, press.
Well, a whole lot of people had been brought in. I don't know by whom or for what purpose into the White House. By the time we got back, somebody was working at my desk and somebody was working at Salinger's desk, and I had to, there's a fellow by the name of Paul Southwick, who was a very good friend of mine, but he kind of taken over my desk, and I had to kind of reclaim it and tell him to get out. And he said, well, I'd been asked to come in to help out. I said, help out what? I said, you don't have anything to help out. Well, they're making the funeral arrangements. I said, well, I'm not going to make the funeral arrangements. I said, neither are you. I said, the Kennedy family's going to be making the funeral arrangements with the assistance of the military district of Washington. Now get out of my desk.
Yeah.
But there was a little bit, I guess really what it was is nobody knew what to do.
Yeah.
So therefore everybody was doing what they thought somebody would want. And it was confusion, let's face it. It had to be confusion.
Somebody told a story, John Davies, who, you know who he is?
Who?
John Davis, who is related to Jackie, a distant cousin or something like that.
I've heard it, yeah.
He's written a couple of books about the family and so forth. And he said, well, at the same time, the Kennedys, the funerals hadn't been planned there. It was John's birthday or something like that. And they were having to plan a birthday party for John in one part of
I guess it is,
White House, and these two different sort of things were going on too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it was. I'd forgotten about that. That didn't get into the realm of my activities at all.
Were you having personal contact with Jackie or Bobby or?
With Jackie, but not a great deal, because mostly, right then and there, the only person that Johnson was dealing with, he was dealing with us. And I don't know whether it was because I had been there in Dallas with him. He and I hit it off just fine. And George Reedy, who'd been his press secretary for a zillion years, he stayed over in the executive office building for a long while. As a matter of fact, he stayed. He didn't come. He didn't become press secretary until March 17, 1964. Salinger stayed with Johnson until St. Patrick's Day. Is the only reason I remember the date.
Did you give any thought after the assassination about leaving
No,
the White House?
no.
Or
Johnson
you wanted
asked
to
me. Johnson
right away
within the 24 hours. Johnson asked me if I
you to
would
stay
stay.
on.
Yeah,
and you were
yeah, sure.
wanting and willing and wanting to do that.
Surely, he's my
Yeah.
president. You know,
Yeah.
he's the only one I had.
Uh,
Well, Kenneth O'Donnell, the chief of staff, he stayed on.
mhm.
Salinger stayed on until for 3 months. Dave Powers stayed on. Ralph Duncan stayed on. Chuck Daly stayed on. George Bundy stayed on. I've gotten my pictures. Who were some of the others? Larry O'Brien stayed on. Who else is in that combined photo? You know that photo in the...
Yeah.
Ted Sorensen stayed on, right, yeah.
Well, would it be right to assume though that some of those people who were say close to Kennedy before he's in the White House and all that sort of thing, maybe wanted to stay in to sort of see if they could help guide some of the programs that he was doing and
Yeah, they did.
that sort of thing.
And they did. And Johnson got through a great number of the New Frontier programs. Some of the civil rights bills and
Yeah.
some of the social bills. And with no disrespect to anyone, Lyndon Johnson was able to get through bills through the Congress that John Kennedy never could have gotten through. And I recall after he got one of the last of the Kennedy portfolio of acts through, and he pushed them through. I mean, he had Harry Byrd down there until 3 o'clock in the mornings.
He could accomplish
Sometime.
that.
Well, Johnson was one of the world's great arm twisters of all time.
We had that reputation. I know.
Yeah, well, and well justified. I remember one time we were at a Gridiron Club dinner at the Statler Hotel in Washington. We went out back to the car, go back to the White House, and the president said to me, he said, Mac, he said, go back in there and get Harry Byrd for me. Now, Harry Byrd of Virginia was a powerful man in the Senate. And he had his fingers, I don't know what committee he would have been on. Rosemary, do you remember what committees Byrd would have been?
That would have been finance.
Finance committee. And he wanted some appropriations. He said, go back and get Harry Byrd. Tell him I want to see him. So I went back to the Gridiron Club dinner, and I said, Senator, I said, the president wants to see you out the car. He said, hell he does. I know what he wants. He said, you just tell him you couldn't find me. I said, Senator, I can't tell the President of the United States I couldn't find you. He'd tell me to go back in until I did find you. He said, yeah, but if I go out there, I know full well what he wants, and I'm not going back to that White House with him. I said, you just want to see at the car. I'll go out to the car, but I'm not going any further. We got close to the car, that door opened, and Harry Byrd gets his arm and boom, into the car. They tell me that Harry Byrd left the White House at 3:30 in the following morning. And all those bills, they went through. But when he was finished with them, Johnson said in his office, he's after one of the signing ceremonies, he said, all right, now we've finished with all of Kennedy's bills. He said, now we're going to start to work on Lyndon Johnson's.
Being what?
That's right.
What were some of the things that say you attribute to Johnson?
Well, the Civil Rights Bill.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly no one could have gotten the Senate, the Southern senators, behind the Civil Rights Bill the way Lyndon Johnson did. No,
Not a Yankee,
certainly not a Yankee Catholic.
From
I mean, let's face it. That
Yeah.
No, a Yankee Catholic, no. And I'm a Yankee myself. I don't say that in any derision to Yankees, but no, he couldn't have gotten it through. Lyndon Johnson could. But then you see, Lyndon Johnson knew the Senate. He knew how to operate in the Senate structure. Within the Senate, there's a thing called, and my wife will correct me on this, I'll harp in on it, honey, called the club. There is no club, but yet there is. It's those senators who work together of both parties to get various things accomplished. I mean, the club would have consisted of Lyndon Johnson and Everett Dirksen.
Yeah.
Lyndon Johnson, Harry Byrd, and Robert Taft. Whereas Kennedy, because of his partially because of his illness with his back, was never really in the club.
In the club, yeah.
But Lyndon Johnson was, and he knew how to get that club to sit up and bark, and bark they did.
What about a comparison in terms of, you were talking about earlier, supplying questions and potential answers that had been done for Eisenhower, but Kennedy did not.
Yeah.
He wanted a question, not the answer. What about with Johnson?
Johnson kept pretty much the same system as Kennedy did. He didn't really pay too much attention to it. But then that fell into disrepute because Johnson would hold a press conference at the drop of a hat and 5 minutes notice, and poor George Reedy would never know a daggone thing about it, and he never wouldn't give you a day's notice. He'd give you 5 minutes notice, call everybody out into the Rose Garden, standing up, and suddenly hold a press conference, or call everybody in to take a picture of him with the Prime Minister of Zimbabwe or something, and set off on a press conference on economics, and nobody would be ready for it. Johnson was terrible about things like that, but the press, of course, loved it because it was a good breaking story, and you had to, and he started to get heavier coverage than. In other words, everything wasn't telegraphed. And a couple of times he held walking press conferences, and if you think they're not fun, when he's walking around the south lawn of the White House trying to get a verbatim transcript of the president's press conference as he's walking around the south lawn of the White House. You've seen that, Bill. And it was, and it was wild. And poor George Reedy, he'd try, like the very devil after Salinger left, to explain to the press how Johnson operated, and tried to explain to Johnson how the press operated, and neither one of them gave a damn how the other operated.
Well, you stayed with the
I
White
stayed
House
until 1965, until the summer of '65.
And left for what reason?
And I went to open my own business, public affairs,
I
public
see.
relations business in Washington, which I did not like.
Yeah,
I didn't like it.
yeah. What prompted you to make that move? Was it just?
Well, it was I had some very good offers,
Yeah.
clients, aircraft companies,
Yeah,
a couple of foreign outfits.
yeah. And subsequent years, you've done what?
Yeah, well then after that I moved out to Las Vegas for a while. I was news director for ABC affiliate in Las Vegas. And I came back to the Washington area, worked for the National Petroleum Council. Then in '77, Rosemary and I got married and went to Beattyville, Kentucky, her hometown, and I became the editor of the local newspaper there, which I just retired from a couple of years ago. Now we're just enjoying retirement.
You enjoying that?
Doing a little public speaking.
Yeah. Have you, in terms of public speaking, have these kind of things been connected with?
Some of them, yeah, most
Kennedy,
of them, yeah,
sort of thing.
most of them. I have to go there.
Okay,
Use
yeah,
a facility.
Right. Well, of course, over the years since the assassination, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of books, articles, all kind of speculations brought forth. Have you paid much attention to this, or?
Well, you keep up to a certain degree, Bob. The problem is, as I say it, that there's always going to be a certain amount of doubt. I at one time likened it to the doubt on Judas, Brutus, and Booth, that here 2,000 years later, people are still saying, well, did Judas really betray Christ, or was it the guy on the, the grassy rock pile, the man on Golgotha or something, and was Booth part of a conspiracy with Mary Surratt? And who said anything about Brutus? He was actually in Naples that day. But I mean, so I suppose a certain degree of skepticism will remain until forever. But for all certainly there has never been a killing that has caused more books to be written. The last count, I understand, 620 books had been written on the Kennedy assassination. And despite the 620 books that have been written, you've had the Warren Commission of people of considerable talent and honesty and decency. You've had a House Committee on Assassinations, which in my not so humble opinion was looking for the sensationalism.
Yeah, I'd like for you to recount a story you told me before.
Conspiracy. Well, I mean, I was at one point the Select Committee on Assassinations of the House was interested in my testimony, and I went over to see them one day, and the chief counsel, whose name is Blakey, interviewed me, and his first question was, before they had held any hearings or anything else, the first question he asked me is, what information could I provide them to support their theory that the assassination was the result of a conspiracy? And I frankly said, I thought that that's what you people were to find out, whether or not this was a conspiracy. I said, no, I don't believe there was a conspiracy, first of all. I said, and I thought that this is why you're in business. I said, seems you've already made up your mind, and that you just formed this committee and holding hearings to substantiate a preconceived notion. He said, well, I didn't really mean to say that. And I said, the hell you didn't. And that's precisely the way I felt. I said, no, I do not feel that it was a conspiracy. I said, I do not believe that after all the investigation that's been done that it wouldn't have turned up something more positive than has been turned up. And he was quite rude about it. He wanted information to support his theory. As it was, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, I read the report, and they sure tried to turn that those hearings and that investigation to support it, and they never did. And they refer in their final closings as the probability of a conspiracy, but they were admit they were unable to prove it. Well, now certainly after 30 years, if there had been a conspiracy, it would have surfaced by now, and certainly someone could not have resisted the temptation to come out and say, yes, I was part of the conspiracy.
There's memory books at the end of our exhibit where people write their thoughts, visitors to the exhibit write their thoughts very frequently, especially after the movie JFK, and if you want to comment on that, we'll get to that, who say, open the files, then we'll know, open the files, then we will know. You have any particular thoughts about this?
Oh, no, because from what I understand, open the files, you're going to have a lot of autopsy pictures, a lot of unsubstantiated mail from a lot of crackpots all over the nation. It's just going to build more on that. That the open the files means a lot more. It does not mean that there is any valid information in those files germane to who killed John Kennedy. There's a whole lot of stuff in there that's just meaningless junk from everything I understand it. So it's too bad that they had to classify some of those files, but I mean, you know, there may be letters in there saying, well, did you know that Bob Porter was part of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy so he could have a job running the library? I mean, you know, it's something just ridiculous like this. And I just feel that that it's a shame, but that's, you know, that they're going to have to be closed, and I'm not for opening the files and and there are also a lot of awfully gory autopsy pictures. I know that.
At the moment, the villains most popular would be FBI, CIA.
Yeah, I know.
And
Ridiculous.
Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Always have been. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's kind of always been that way, or was that amplified by the movie JFK? Did you, by the way, see that movie?
No. I would not. I wouldn't even. I was asked to see it and make comments on it, and I said, wait a minute. I said, this is called a docudrama.
Yes.
I said, I think, and I published this, I think it's a great disservice to the American public for Oliver Stone to have this movie out, because there's no little star that pops on the screen that says this part's documentary and this part's drama. And and people, for whatever reason, want to believe conspiracy theory. That's fun. It's fun. It's something. It's almost like a toy to play with, and that annoys me very honestly. And I don't see any reason to get the public into believing that their government would lie to them that much. God knows they do have some reason to know that the government has lied in the past, but on this one, no, certainly not the Warren Commission. I don't know about it's not a lie from the House Committee on Assassinations, because God only knows, I'm sure they tried as much as they could to find a conspiracy, and they couldn't. But as I say, it's fun. I think that people feel more comfortable believing there was a conspiracy, and I think the reason for that is that people just somehow don't want to believe, or are not comfortable in believing, that the President of the United States is subject to that easy a shot and can be assassinated that easy. But we're an open society, and we've seen it before, and as I mentioned earlier, we had the attempted assassination of Roosevelt, we had the attempted assassination of Truman, of two on poor Gerald Ford. I don't know what he ever did to anybody, but I mean, McKinley, Garfield, Lincoln, and there's one more, and I can't remember who else. But I mean, you have these assassinations, and I think that the people just feel that our presidents should be more secure than that. But you can't do it in an open society. We're not a little banana republic.
Well, Kennedy himself was quoted as, saying if somebody wanted to get him, they could.
That's right, absolutely.
Yeah.
And somebody
That's
can
something
get
you have to live with,
and somebody can get Clinton if they want to. Somebody could have gotten George Bush or Ronald Reagan or Lyndon Johnson or Jimmy Carter or Nixon.
Of course, and then another one of the criticisms that comes in has to do with the security. Not only, of course, most damned perhaps would be the Dallas police, but also, say, the Secret Service and wasn't doing their job and so forth. Any thoughts you have about that? Was as far as you knew,
if you ran a computer check right now, the President of the United States is coming. How many crackpots have you got in Dallas? If you took the entire United States Army, you couldn't cover them all. And that doesn't go just for Dallas. I mean, that would go if you were in Miami and New York or Walla Walla, Washington, for God's sake. It's just not possible. You just have to rely in hopes that whoever's going to do it or give it a shot. Number one, they'll lose their courage or they're thwarted. But if some man, keeping his own counsel, saying nothing to anyone, without spilling the beans ahead of time, makes up his mind that he's going to kill the President of the United States, he'll be able to do it. Look at Jack Ruby. I mean, whoever would have thought that he was good old Jack Ruby? You know the situation here better than I do. It was not unusual to see Jack Ruby around a police station. He walks up and he blows Oswald right off the face of the earth. And so I think that any time someone makes up their mind they're going to take somebody out, they'll take them out.
You didn't come back to Dallas or anything, or have any follow-up kind of thing, say, with bringing up Jack Ruby, the Jack Ruby trial, or anything like that?
No.
Yeah, wouldn't be any reasons you would have had.
No, this is only the second time I've been back to Dallas since the assassination. I was back here in the 70s for a British filming. And I never know what happened to that one, and I'm here now to do a taping of a independent British outfit who's doing a 30th anniversary. Sorry. Did procedures or anything much change, say, within your office, say, after the assassination took place? No, not in the press office. If local organizations wanted to cover the arrival of the president, they'd have to let the local politicians or who was ever running the show know in advance enough in advance who they were going to assign, what their social security number was, so they could throw it through a computer. But you know, if a president is going to Keokuk and he's going to address 10,000 people, why worry about 3 reporters from the Keokuk Times and do a whole check on them, because you're not going to be able to do a check on the 10,000 that are going to get probably tickets from every ward healer and either that or grocery store clerk in Keokuk.
Yeah. Was kind of the inner circle at the White House kind of quickly make a transition over to we have to continue business as usual?
I think most of us did. There were some of them who spent an awful lot of time kind of mourning the president's passing.
Yeah,
You know. And it's too bad, because some of them were very talented people who just more or less kind of made a career out of being Kennedy mourners. But to me, it was kind of, you know, the torch has passed, as they'd said, and they, you know, the king is dead, long live the king. We're a country whose laws provide for such things, and you have to go on. The government goes on. The government doesn't stop.
Were you, say, in your office Saturday as opposed to, and then Sunday when the, you know, during the funeral proceedings, and then?
I was on my way up to there were services up at the rotunda of the Capitol that day, and I was going up on my way up to, and we had to share our car, our cars. We had a garage then that had a few more cars than Mr. Clinton is allowing. He apparently has cut down on the number of cars, which won't last, but he wants to think it does.
Make the gesture.
Yeah, make the big gesture. And I know I shared my car with Billy Graham. As a matter of fact, we were in the car.
Right.
I was in the car when a message came over that Oswald had been shot by Ruby.
That's where
And the
you
only
were.
problem was, you know, they got the message garbled. They immediately knew who had shot Oswald. They got the name slightly wrong. They said it had been shot by Jack Rubley.
Rubley?
You remember the L in there?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Signal Corps officer who we left here to cover was a Major Jack Rubley,
Oh, my gosh.
which was funny. Do you remember him, Bill?
I guess so. And you were with Billy Graham at that
I was with
time?
Billy Graham, was in my car.
You recall his reaction? Or
Oh, he
anything
said,
had
well,
to
just
say?
how, yeah, he said, isn't that terrible? When will this all end? Sort of
Yeah.
attitude.
Yeah.
But I mean, you
Well,
know,
go ahead.
you can't do that chest thumping too much, because, you know, things are going to happen. It's just...
Well, I guess, you know, the Ruby thing was one of the major contributions to all the conspiracy.
Oh, sure.
That set off later.
Right, exactly.
And,
But I just, I've never seen, of all these books that you have here, of all these great, you know, post-mortems and the Oswald affair and all this, you mean to tell me they couldn't pin it down if it was actually a conspiracy?
Yeah,
I can't buy that.
who had to deal with all the talk? Speaking of sort of the problems of dealing with the press office dealing with all the dignitaries that came in for the funerals. and all
No,
that kind
the
of stuff?
State
Was
Department.
the
No,
State
most of
Department
the
did that?
State Department Office of Protocol
Yeah.
did that. Yeah.
Yeah.
We had many people coming in from overseas. Of course, in June of '63, President Kennedy had been to Ireland, and a big group had come over from Ireland, including one of the fellows he was the chairman of the New Ross County Council, and I had done. He was one of the favorites of Kennedy's that Kennedy met on the trip over there. I did the advance work, and his name was Andrew Minahan, and he had a big red beard, and he was a great-looking man. And the map of Ireland, he made Barry Fitzgerald look like an Arab. I mean, it was just marvelous. And he came over, and he was just, they just loved him in Ireland.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, you know, I never saw a crowd. I think the whole nation was at every one of our stops in Ireland. I never saw such crowds in my life.
Well, one of the people from Dallas, one of the community leaders, who later became Mayor Eric Johnson, was one of the representatives from Dallas who went to Washington, felt they should have some presence there. and said that they were standing on a hotel room balcony looking out, and with the gall, and said, you know, the thought occurred to them, if we had a rifle here, we could have taken out.
Oh, you mean on the parade up to
Yeah,
the...
parade
Well, he
up.
must have been staying at the Mayflower Hotel.
Yeah, I think that's where he was.
Yeah, because that's where we went. That's where that parade... I've seen, every time I see that, de Gaulle marched right at the head of that
Yeah.
foreign, and he was a pot shot for anybody, and remember he
Yeah,
was having
right.
trouble in Algeria at the
Yeah.
time. And if you go to Paris 3 or 4 times a night, you'd hear that ee-aw,
Yeah.
somebody racing because they'd set another bomb off.
Yeah.
And he refused Secret Service protection. He
Yeah.
absolutely would have no bodyguards around him for that walk from the White House
Yeah.
all the way, and he's almost blind as a bat.
Well,
Yeah.
he's yeah, in one of the films in the exhibit, there's a clip of that. you
Yeah,
know,
he's just
he really-
blind as a bat. And here he walked just as stiff as he could right up Connecticut Avenue to St. Matthews, and I'll tell you, that was one impressive sight. The only other impressive
Yeah.
sight that impressed me more was at the graveside.
Mm.
Uh,
Describe that for us.
Well, after the services at St. Matthews, the motorcade went its way out to Constitution Avenue, across Memorial Bridge, up to Arlington Cemetery. Going to Arlington Cemetery for me is kind of like old home week. I've got most of my family members are buried there.
Mm.
And as the services were going off on that knoll just beneath the Lee House, the Robert E. Lee mansion, Air Force One, it's on a hill, and we're looking up at the mansion, and the grave was down here. Suddenly Air Force One comes across. They'd had the fighter planes coming
Yeah.
with a missing man
Yeah.
formation.
Uh-huh.
Then Air Force One came in at about 500 feet.
Mm.
And 26000 and dipped its wings, and I tell you, that sent a chill right up my spine. And I was doing great until that, and I kind of broke down a little bit on that.
Well, that
And
was
Jim
when,
Swindell
yeah.
did a real dip. I mean, he dipped that baby. Why you start dipping a 707? You're dipping a hunk of machinery. I'll tell you, that was a very, very
Well, there's a very
poignant moment.
poignant also moment with Walter Cronkite in some of the videos we have where he passed along. I think you saw that little part of that where he
Right.
had to pass along the announcement where he obviously was choking and holding back.
Right.
Maybe that's when that kind of hit him too, I think.
Yeah, he went through the same thing when Bobby was killed.
Mhm.
I spotted for Cronkite. Don Hewitt, who's an executive producer for 60 Minutes, called me the night Bobby was killed and asked me to get to New York right away, and could I do it? And I said yes. In '68, and I went up there and I did what someone was spotting, and I stayed in the control room and spotted, and I was feeding Cronkite all who these various people were who were on the train, and as the train came to Washington and all that. But he's a very emotional guy, Cronkite.
Well, I guess all of us who are old enough to recall it, at some
Yeah.
point there, it really hit us too.
Right.
It really hits you that way. Well, just to kind of clarify one little other thing about talking about the 3 shots, you were satisfied they all came from the same direction.
There's never been
Same sound, same...
never any question in my mind from that day to this as from where the shots originated, the sound of them, and where they... No, absolutely not. I was never...
Did you
Never.
compare notes with any of the other people, say, in the motorcade about that or anything like that?
No,
Or just
because
that-
the others in the motorcade, the others in the newsmen were in my car. They were not even in as good a position as I was to hear it because I had the open window. I had my Merriman Smith was sitting in the middle. I've talked to Secret Service men like Roy Kellerman, who was riding a shotgun in the front seat. Talked to Clint Hill, and Clint, Roy's dead now, which I didn't even know until a couple months ago. But there was never any question in their mind.
Yeah, seems to be the general
Yeah.
feeling.
No, but I mean, for somebody like
in
Mark
that
Lane,
position.
it makes for great copy when you want to write another book and make another couple of $1,000s on a lecture tour around the country when you weren't even there.
Yeah. Before we end these interviews, we always ask the subject if there's anything that we have not discussed.
No,
anything
not
you'd like
really.
to
I
add
just, the only thing
to
that I
this.
would say, and the one thing that I think most Americans are not appreciative of, and I'm not saying that just because I'm taping in Texas. I've said it for 30 years that I don't think I don't think that could have been in better shape than having the government turned over to Lyndon Johnson.
Mm.
That he was the master of it from the first moment. That he had he was the calmest and coolest of us all.
Mm.
He seemed to know exactly what what should be done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that he proved that it was he was a credit to the American political system as to how as they would say, how the torch was passed.
Mm-hmm. Have you kept in touch with Lady Bird, Mrs. Johnson?
Yeah, we were down there.
Mm-hmm.
When was that, honey? Last.
1990.
Yeah, 1990. We went down for the library dedication.
Well, obviously,
What
we'd
was
like
that
to.
for? No, it was the anniversary of the Great Society, is what it was.
okay.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. I had been down for the dedication of the library before that.
Obviously, we'd love to get to her with one of these interviews.
Yeah.
So,
Delightful lady.
yeah.
Delightful
We've heard
lady.
she is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you once
You bet,
again.
bud.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.